had that big bell and that power? I'll show you.
Stand up, Tom Chaney!
So I think it's fair to say that I like me a good western, whether it's American classics such as Howard Hawks' El Dorado, or John Sturgis's The Magnificent Seven, or whether it be more modern examples such as the Coen brothers' True Grit, or Quentin Tarantino's Hateful Eight. I've even watched some of the older black and white movies and they hold up a lot better than I thought they would. Also, does Westworld count as a western? I hope so. Now look, don't get me wrong, it's not like westerns are my all-time favourite genre, and I think it's fair to say that some of these movies are not exactly all that well made or well written, but man, I still enjoy watching them nonetheless. I think my love for them comes from the fact that one of the first games I had on Windows 2000 was the Western first-person shooter Outlaws. It's not a very well-known game, and by today's standards, it is pretty outdated. Although to be fair to it, it was not a visual powerhouse for its time, but even so, it's argued by a lot of people, me included, that it is one of the best games made by LucasArts. Yeah, that LucasArts. In between making Star Wars Dark Forces, they made a Western game, and they did a really good job at doing it. But look, even if I didn't play that game as a kid, I'm sure I'd be making this video, because the best Westerns are not just good Westerns, I think they are good movies, full stop. And the one that really seems to rise to the top, and is arguably one of the greatest films of all time, is Sergio Leone's 1966 epic, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now I promise you I'm not overstating it when I say this movie is nothing short of iconic. Even if you've never seen it, I bet you've heard of it, or you've seen some reference or homage to it. Whether it's the Mexican standoff scene in Reservoir Dogs, whether it's the episode in Friends where Joey dresses up as a cowboy to sell cologne, or whether it's the design for Boba Fett from Star Wars, which was inspired by the character, the man with no name, who we see in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly and its sister films, for a few dollars more, and Fistful of dollars. And I really do mean it when I say sister films, not trilogy, because even though these three films are all westerns, they're all pretty similar. They all have Clint Eastwood playing pretty much the exact same character, wearing the exact same costume. They're all directed by Sergio Leone, and they all came out within about a year of each other. Technically, they're not related, or at least in universe. So yeah, sister films, not trilogy. But even still, these movies are iconic, and they really do define how a lot of us seem to view westerns, or at least the American West. They're the reason why we probably associate this music with the American West. Rather than say, this music. The thing is though, on paper at least, you really wouldn't have bet that these movies would have been the movies to define how we think of a genre. An American genre at that. Because that backdrop there, it ain't Texas. And none of those actors on screen there are American. And in fact, none of them had probably been to America. And most of them probably didn't speak English either. What this film actually is a Western set in America during the American Civil War. It was directed by an Italian director who spoke no English. It was headlined by 3 American actors who didn't speak Italian. The rest of the cast also didn't speak English. In fact, most of them probably didn't speak the same language as each other. And it was shot in Spain, with a relatively low budget. At least on paper, this movie should not have worked. But it did, and it worked so well that it went on to define how we view Westerns. And it's even argued by a lot of historians that the depiction of the American Civil War in this movie is done a lot better than a lot of American movies are able to do. And look, here's the thing, there's really nothing that I can say about this movie about why it's great or why that it works that hasn't already been said 1,000 times already on the internet. Whether it's the amazing score by Ennio Morricone, or the amazing cinematography and the beautiful wide landscape shots, or the fantastic writing and directing by Sergio Leone. If you haven't already seen this movie, I really encourage you to pick up a copy and watch it. It's definitely a long movie. If you see the proper uncut version, which I do recommend, it's just under 3 hours long, but it's definitely worth seeing and the payoff at the end is well worth the watch. What I do want to talk about though, and hopefully you find it interesting, is just how close on several occasions this movie came to not being made at all. And by that, I mean you can't make an iconic movie if you kill 2/3 of your main cast. I mean, you can probably try, but the result probably won't be very good. And I really do mean it. On several occasions, Eli Wallach, who plays Tuco, and Clint Eastwood, who plays Blondie or the man with no name, both come very close to being killed. And even more amazingly, some of these close calls were recorded on film and even make it into the final cast of the film. Now, before I talk about their close calls, I do want to first talk about the context surrounding this film, because I think the history behind it and its sister films is really interesting. So, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly and its sister films come from a genre called the spaghetti western, because unlike a true western, which was typically made in America by American production companies for an American audience, these were a more budget European take on the genre. I think they do have a bit of a reputation for being a cheap European import, and to some extent I think that is a bit unfair, because whilst some of these movies did make it over to America, and stylistically they are very different compared to your normal Hollywood western, in the sense that they are a more gritty take on the genre. The spaghetti westerns were also typically a lot more violent than the Hollywood westerns, and many of the violent scenes were usually cut out and censored for the US releases. But first and foremost, what these films really are European films made about the American West. They're made for Europeans, by Europeans, and they are typically financed by Europeans. They were typically shot either in Italy or Spain, hence the name spaghetti westerns, and most of the times these movies would be in either Spanish or Italian. And out of a catalogue of probably hundreds of spaghetti westerns, only a select few ever made it into America. And I really do mean hundreds. I mean, go to the Wikipedia article for spaghetti westerns and just take a scroll down. I mean, there's got to be hundreds of them. Unfortunately, it looks like some of them have been lost to time, but there's quite a few of them that have been uploaded to YouTube. Most of them don't have an English dub, most of them are just subtitled, and looking at some of them, I can see why some of these movies were a bit derided in America. My favourite one that I stumbled on is Hercules and the Incan Treasure, and I mean, it is as good as it sounds. Now, a big overarching theme for these spaghetti westerns is the fact that they typically didn't have the same budgets as the big American westerns. To give you some rough idea about the budget, Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood's first film together, which was A Fistful of Dollars, had a budget around 1/10 that was given to the Magnificent Seven, around about $200,000. And of that $200,000, Clint Eastwood was paid about $15,000, around about 7.5% of the entire budget. And 7.5% of the budget is a fair chunk to be spent on one actor. And the crazy thing is, Clint Eastwood was Sergio Leone's cheap backup option. He originally wanted Henry Fonda for the role, but because Henry Fonda was already at the time a big established actor, he was just way too expensive for the role. Thankfully for Leone, the rest of the cast was going to be a lot cheaper. They were local and they were obviously paid a lot less. The interesting thing is, though, that when they were on set, they wouldn't typically be speaking the same language as each other. They'd be employing actors from several different countries, and there is no chance that they'd be able to speak the same language on set. If you have a look at the cast of this film, you'll see that Sergio Leone was hiring actors from Spain, Italy, Hungary, and Canada, and there is no chance that they're all going to be speaking Italian. Like I said before, Clint Eastwood, he couldn't speak Italian, and the rest of the cast, they weren't going to be speaking English either. Now, normally this will cause you issues because on a film set you have to talk to other actors, and if you have no idea what the other person is saying, that's going to be a little bit difficult. So how did they get around that? Well, simply, you wait for the other actor to finish speaking their line, even though you have no idea what they're saying, but the second they finish their lines, you use that as a cue to start speaking your lines. And looking at the results of the movie, it obviously worked. On the technical side, it really wasn't much of an issue because typically when they'd be filming these westerns, they wouldn't be recording any audio on location. And all the dialogue was recorded in a studio at a later date. And in doing so, you dub it for the local language for each release. Now, when it came time to making The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, because there was a successful release of For a Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More in America, and also because they now had backing from American production company United Artists, the budget given to The Good, the Bad and the Ugly was substantially higher than the previous two films. Fistful of Dollars had roughly $200,000 to work with, and that was increased to about $600,000 for A Few Dollars More. The budget given to The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, though, was about $1.2 million. And it is definitely noticeable. The scope for the third movie is by far and away the most expansive of the three. Far larger and more varied sets, more props, much bigger scenes that involved hundreds of extras. Authentic cannons and gear were hired out for the Civil War scenes, a 5,000 grave cemetery was constructed for the final scene, they even went to the effort to construct a real proper bridge, and then they went ahead and blew it up with dynamite. Still though, let's not pretend that the budget was out of this world. It was still treated in many ways as if it was a budget film, and I think the best example of that was Clint Eastwood's costume. Obviously, it was carried over in pretty much its entirety from the previous two movies, and the costume itself, it was nothing to write home about. Most of the costume was Clint Eastwood's, he brought it over from America, including his gun belt, which was the exact same gun belt which he wore on the TV show Rawhide. And the crazy thing is, there were no backups or spares of the costume, so pretty much what he wore was the only example of the costume that they had. So for example, if his hat went missing, that was going to cause them a lot of problems, because that was the only hat that they had. And because Clint Eastwood didn't necessarily trust the crew to keep the costume safe at night, what he'd do was, at the end of filming, he'd take it back to the hotel, and then he'd bring it back the next day, wear it during filming, and then once filming had finished, he'd take it back home at night. Compare this to more modern movies where there are going to be backups for pretty much everything. I mean, it does not get more budget than that. But really, just looking at these movies, you'd have no idea just how tight the budget was. And I think a lot of that comes down to Sergio Leone's vision and direction. But like I said before, you can't make an iconic movie if you kill 2/3 of your main cast. Because as skillful as Leone and the crew were, I think it's fair to say that safety was not entirely high on the list of priorities when they were making this movie. And look, it's not just me being in 2025 looking back at 1966 and saying, look how dangerous they were with their leaded paint and their asbestos cladding and their aluminium wiring. Even by the standards of the day, Italian film sets were not highly regarded in terms of their safety, at least compared to Hollywood film sets. And obviously the reason for it is not down to malice or anything like that. I think the reason for it is over in Italy, there's no Hollywood, there's no actors guilds, there's just an overall less focus on safety. And if you read Quentin Tarantino's book, he pretty much sums it up as Sergio Leone, he loved filming westerns and he really wanted to make the movie that he wanted to make. You might almost kill an actor along the way, but getting that shot is definitely worth it. So I guess at this point, let's talk about their close calls with death. And obviously, spoilers ahead. So let's start things off at the beginning of the movie. Tuco, played by Eli Wallach, is about to be hanged for his many crimes. He has a noose around his neck, and once they slap the horse, it's going to run off, leaving Tuco behind. Now little does the crowd know that Blondie, played by Clint Eastwood, is standing a distance away, ready to shoot the rope, cut it in two, and help Tuco escape. Now the crazy thing is, this scene, for the most part, was done for real. That really is Eli Wallach hanging up there, and he really does have his hands bound. Obviously it's not a proper noose, that would have been one step too far, but that rope really is holding him there, and it is going to be cut so he can escape. I think it's fair to say that this scene is pretty tough and demanding, especially considering that Eli Wallach is not trained as a stunt actor. And whilst this scene and stunt thankfully worked pretty much to plan, another one went a lot worse. Now the way that they make the rope break in two is that they put a small amount of explosive in the rope itself. You can actually see it if you zoom in, it's about halfway up. Now according to Eli Wallach, if you're going to do this sort of stunt, what you'd normally do, at least in Hollywood, is you'd put some cotton wadding in the horse's ears so it wouldn't get too startled when the real explosion goes off. And he even mentions this to Sergio Leone in their broken communication in French no less. And Leone assures him that the stunt will be fine, the horse doesn't need any wadding. Turns out though, the horse absolutely did, and the horse freaked out. And it takes off about a mile down the road. Now normally this would be okay because Eli Wallach knows how to ride a horse, but unfortunately during this scene, he has his hands tied up for real behind his back. So effectively he's on the back of a horse that's racing down the road at full speed, and he's just hoping that the horse eventually tires itself out and just stops. And thankfully, after a while, the horse eventually did slow down and calm down. But there was a very real risk that he could have been bucked off the horse at a high speed and that could have very easily injured him or very easily killed him. Safe to say, a first of what would be many close calls during the filming of this movie. So if we fast forward to about halfway through the movie, Tuco is being taken away by Corporal Wallace, and knowing his luck, he's probably going to be hanged again. But in a moment of quick thinking, he pushes both of them out of the train. He kind of has to, they're both handcuffed to each other, and Tuco, he is desperate to escape. Now I have no doubt here that this stunt was done with stunt doubles. I mean, even for the time, obviously they're going to use stunt doubles, and you know, even stunt double or no stunt double, it looks like a pretty demanding stunt. The real danger for Eli Wallach though comes in the next scene, because he's now out of the train, but he's still handcuffed to the unconscious Wallace and he doesn't have the keys. So the question is, what does he do? What he does is he lays Wallace on the tracks, lays the handcuff chains on the rail, and he waits for a locomotive to come along and cut the chains in two. And the crazy thing is, this was all done for real. I mean, just looking at it, that really is Eli Wallach there. That really is a locomotive, and the chains really do get cut in two. I mean, just looking at it, nowadays this would not be done for real, but this was all done for real. The only trickery here is that the chains were made from soft lead so that they would easily be cut. Obviously that is an incredibly dangerous stunt, but the real danger comes about here, because unbeknownst to Sergio Leonne when they were getting the scene ready, there were a bunch of steps protruding from the bottom of the train that they weren't aware of, and if Eli Wallach had raised his head too early during the scene, the stairs would have smacked into his head, and to put it in Eli Wallach's words, he probably would have been decapitated in that scene. And all of this stems from the fact that Sergio Leonne was pretty determined that Eli Wallach would be there in the scene doing this stunt. He wanted a close-up on Eli Wallach's face right next to the train tracks, and he wanted the audience to know that that was Eli Wallach right there and not some sort of stunt double. Now moving on to the end of the film, poor old Eli Wallach, once again, he almost gets taken out by Lee Van Cleef, who plays Angel Eyes or the Bad. Now in theory the shot should be pretty simple, but in execution it is pretty dangerous. So what we see is Lee Van Cleef, he lines up a shovel so that it's in frame, and then he throws it at Eli. Or at least he throws it past Eli, but it gets a little bit close for my liking, and I'm sure it gets a bit close for Eli, because I've done this frame by frame just to see how close it gets, and it only misses his forehead by a few inches. I mean, it gets so incredibly close. And obviously being a spaghetti western and it being made back in the 1960s, I doubt that that is a prop shovel. You know, that is going to be a proper shovel, and I'm sure a heavy old shovel being thrown at your forehead could do a lot of damage. I have no idea how it didn't hit him, but thankfully it doesn't. And unfortunately, it doesn't get much easier for Eli Wallach, because at the end of the movie, once he's finally dug up the gold that they've been searching for, he almost gets killed doing that as well. So what Sergio Leonne wanted in the final scene was for Tuco to finally get the bags full of gold, and for him to hit it with a shovel, and for the bags to burst open at the seams, revealing the gold coins inside. Now to get this exact effect that he wanted, the production team used an acid to weaken the fibres of the bag, so when he hit it with a shovel, it would burst easily. Unfortunately, the acid was pretty haphazardly stored in a lemon soda bottle, a lemon soda that reportedly was the favourite of Eli Wallach. So he sees a bottle of his favourite lemon soda, he goes to take a drink, and unfortunately, the acid, which was in the bottle, burns the inside of his mouth. He quickly spat it out, but apparently it did a fair amount of damage to the inside of his mouth. Lucky for Eli Wallach though, A, he was able to recover from his burns, and B, he doesn't have too much dialogue in the final scenes of the movie, so he was able to do all these scenes and carry on. So finally, let's bring in Clint Eastwood, because like Eli Wallach, he also almost gets killed during the making of this movie. Although, how close he gets to being killed is a little bit up in the air, and you'll see why in a minute. So let's go about 3/4 of the way into the film. This is flat bang in the middle of the US Civil War between the Confederates and the Union Army. For me, it is easily one of the highlights of the film, and it's probably where a huge chunk of the budget went. Now, the battle is ended by Tuco and Blondie tying dynamite to the bridge and blowing it up. The bridge connects a river, and the river separates the two armies. The real question is though, how do you do this sort of shot? These days obviously it would be done using computer generated imagery, but back then it would have been done using maybe a miniature. You blow up a miniature and film it in such a way that it looks like, you're blowing up the real deal. But obviously that wasn't Leone's style, so how does he do it? Well, he builds a bridge and he blows it up. And again, this is not some sort of prop bridge made out of foam and balsa wood. This is a proper bridge, made from proper dense wood and stone. It was even made by the Spanish army on the condition that the Spanish captain was allowed to blow it up. Which I guess is a pretty good deal, hey? And to blow up a bridge as substantial as this, well, to do that, you simply load it up with hundreds of pounds of dynamite and you blow it up. You blow it up for real. And that's exactly what they did. They loaded it up with dynamite and they set it off and it looks like this. No, literally it looked like that. Apparently there was some miscommunication between the Spanish captain and the people that were getting ready to film the bridge, and the captain blew it up early and none of the cameras were running. Now apparently they were very apologetic about this, so they reconstructed the whole bridge over the course of about 3 weeks. So after 3 weeks, they came back and they blew it up again. And the results are, well, let's have a look. Pretty spectacular. I mean, that is no match to even the best CGI bridge. Although, did you see that? Now, I don't know about you, but that looks to be a several kilo piece of rock flying at a great amount of speed, hurling towards Clint Eastwood. And I don't know about you, but a several kilo piece of rock hurling towards you could do a lot of damage. Now, whether that was Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach in that exact scene right there is a little bit up for debate. One of the commentary tracks for The Good, the Bad and the Ugly would suggest that those were stunt doubles, but none of the other commentary tracks that I've listened to and none of the interviews that I've seen would suggest that those were stunt doubles. Most of them would suggest that that was both Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach there. But literally, if that rock was maybe a meter over to the left, and, well, we might not have gotten Dirty Harry. The real crazy thing is though, is that Sergio Leone originally wanted Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach to be a lot closer to the explosion than where they were. Originally he wanted them to be much further down into the valley, and it was only due to Clint Eastwood's skepticism, at least his skepticism of Sergio Leone's safety. He insisted that they'd be a lot further back from the explosion. To put it pretty much in Clint Eastwood's words, he asked where Sergio Leone was going to be during the explosion. And probably to no one's surprise, Sergio Leone was planning on being a lot further away from the explosion. And effectively Clint Eastwood said to him, "Look, we'll be as close to the explosion as you are." Which, like I said, was a lot further away. And judging by the debris that is thrown out by the explosion, that was probably a good call. Thankfully in the end though, no one was killed on this movie, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly was released, and it has left its mark on cinema history. Again, if you haven't watched this movie, I really encourage you to do so. Yeah, it's a little bit long and some of the dubbing at points is a little bit distracting, but I promise you, it is well worth it. There's not a minute wasted, and the cinematography and the dialogue, and sometimes the lack thereof, and the score, I mean, it is all worth it. It is easily one of the best westerns and probably one of the greatest films of all time. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.